Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists that we have today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Looking forward to having our conversation for today. You know, the state of Arizona has been having some interesting dialogue. And one of the issues is they're now starting to send taxpayer money to religious schools. Now, that's not something that's new, but there's a private school in Arizona that's called Dream City. And it's a school that happens to be affiliated with the local megachurch, and that megachurch has been involved with doing partisan politics, even holding campaign rallies. And they recently at the school broke new ground. They're putting in a new wing, they're putting in a new classroom, pickleball court, all the things you think you'd like to see. And it's clearly a sign of growth. And they have partnered with a partisan political adversary group and an advocacy group. And all of these institutions are trying to figure out what on earth is going on. Now, the problem is that the Dream City has been doing extremely well. But there's another school that's called Paradise Valley and other public schools in Arizona that have had to close. And the thought process is maybe if there was less money going to these quote unquote religious schools, and what's even different about this school is this school also claims that it is there to really stamp out liberal thinking, making sure that we're not focused on anything having to do with gender identification. So the school doesn't just seem like it's quote unquote a religious school, but it seems like it's almost a political religious school. And as a result thereof, there's a question, is this going in the right direction? It turns out that Dream City has gotten over $2 million of taxpayer funds to move forward with its project. You know, Bettina, the idea of making sure that all schools get what's available is one thing, but I'm wondering, are we starting to see a bridge too far if now your religious school is even touting what some would view as political viewpoints, or is this something that is just much to do about nothing?
So, Orlin, this is clearly a case that demonstrates why this issue of school vouchers in America is still alive and kicking after so many years. I mean, this is a case where a school is not only receiving funding from the state for its religious views, but also it has a clear political slant. And when you dig into the data, it shows that it is disproportionately serving white, wealthy students. So that's one issue. But here's the problem with any time we discuss this issue. This issue is always going to coalesce around two poles. You're going to have those on the political right who say that school choice, increasing school choice, is always a good idea. It is always this magic silver bullet for everything that's wrong with America's public school system. Then there are those on the left who say that every school choice program is always going to wreak havoc on the public school system, and it always crosses that establishment line between church and state. Neither of those are correct. We have to have a more nuanced conversation about school vouchers in America. This is clearly an outlier case. Well, I hope it's an outlier case, but it demonstrates the inherent problems with our school voucher system. And it also demonstrates why we need a much more nuanced conversation about this topic.
No, Tim Schultz, what are your thoughts on this? You know, when we start seeing that now it's one thing to have religious schools that are getting funding, but when they start having a mandate that seems to be very politically slanted, utilizing language that we're used to seeing in the political, what I would call public square, is that a problem, or is this just the direction that we're going in?
There's so many things to unpack here. I just want to start by saying I'm very adamantly pro pickleball, and any school that has a pickleball court, I think, is worthy of at least consideration for parents. Is my starting point. The second thing I'll say is this is a classic example to me of where something may be constitutional but still a bad idea. Right. I don't think this violates the Constitution as I understand the religion clauses, but I think that when religious people sort of push their rights to the nth degree, it often undermines those rights because people just say you're crazy, and it makes the rights less durable and popular with a wide swath of Americans. I think it's dangerous for the state to say, well, you have a kind of religious expression. And if the state kind of says, look, we don't like you to be able to get this because we don't like your theological or theopolitical expression. Look, there are lots of predominantly Black churches in the United States that have political candidates in their churches that do get out the vote drives. If they have church schools and most of the candidates they have through their Democratic and they have church schools, should they be ineligible for vouchers because of their theopolitical expression? That would really violate our sense of right and wrong, and I think would itself violate the Constitution. It wouldn't be viewpoint neutral to do that. So I think that's probably, though, what kind of more onto what Bettina said, is that this is sort of what you get into when you start having vouchers. Like, they're going to flow to places that have beliefs that are way outside the mainstream of the average taxpayer. And so that's kind of where that's one of the trade-offs of having universal voucher programs.
Todd, you and I have actually worked on a few matters as it related to religious schools. And one of the things that looked like the government would be driving into is words that are in the handbook. And it seemed like those words in the handbook were the things that helped them to kind of get a feel of, is this something that's religious? But I don't know if we ever talked about words in the handbook that actually sounded political, and whether or not that does make a difference or not, even based on some of the things that you've seen in the past.
Well, first of all, unlike religion, which there's an establishment clause for, there is no political prohibition in the Constitution, right? So there is those same concerns don't come up. And as Tim Schultz said, schools have long been political. You go to certain schools in the country, there's absolutely no question which candidate they support, which candidate the teacher's supporting in the classroom. I think the problem with this is that the education system, the teachers' unions, have turned America's schools into an ideological indoctrination system. And they have, no longer, if you are outside of the sort of the mainstream of where the education elite is, can you send your kid there and think that they're going to get a quality education that does not go contrary to your beliefs. And I think that's where religious people have come from. Has there been maybe some counter reaction? Perhaps. But yeah, I think parents and parents of faith have real reasons to be concerned about public schools. These are not schools that are just teaching, students how to read, how to write, about science in a neutral way. It is absolutely getting behind sort of political ideology. We've talked about this in other cases. Montgomery County, where I'm at right now, had a whole LGBT indoctrination going down into kindergarten. And so I do think parents have a right to direct the education of their students, and that, teachers and teacher unions don't get to override what parents want to decide. But that is clearly the direction a lot of them are going.
Yeah, I think this is, we are where we are in Arizona, in large part because of the Zellman versus Simmons-Harris decision 23 years ago. Once the Supreme Court rejected the view that the Establishment Clause prevented school vouchers, it essentially became open season for private religious-based education to do the kinds of things that we're seeing in Arizona. I've always been less concerned about the legality of school vouchers than I have been about the morality of school vouchers. I can't understand for the life of me why any religious school who was really true to their religious views would want to participate in the voucher program and accept government money, because in doing that, you are sort of undermining your own mission as a religious school. In the Judeo-Christian prophetic tradition, the church sort of stands over against the state to criticize it, to keep it in line, to rebuke it. And I don't know how that can happen if the church is sort of on the take, if the church is being supported by government money. What do we make of the moral and spiritual obligation of church members of various denominations or religions to support their own institutions? Because they claim to believe in a God, at least in the Christian case, that is self-sufficient. And if you are to reflect that God, then why in the world would you be excited about receiving money to support a mission that could easily be, at some point, compromised?
Okay,
But Tim, the answer to that is because schools are expensive to run. Also, most of the schools, the Protestant system and the Catholics, had education systems, had schools well before the government, well before public schools, they had schools. In fact, schooling started out as an educational plan. Harvard used to be a faith-based institution. When government comes in, you make it sound like government money is just something that falls from the sky. It's not. It's these very people, these voters' money. There is no such thing as government money. All there is taxpayer money that the government redistributes. And so
Todd,
the reason they want this is because it is an expensive thing that the government has come in and just stomped in with public education. And they feel like they should be able to participate in this.
Todd, you're making my point. Catholic schools and other religious schools have been around long before government, and they functioned well. I am a product of a Catholic education in Philadelphia. I went to I was part of the parish of the Immaculate Conception that functioned very, very well without receiving, okay, now you call it taxpayer money, without receiving taxpayer money. The point that I'm making is that it doesn't make sense to me if I'm a religious person who genuinely cares about the mission of my religious organization or Christian denomination or whatever the case may be. I see it as a problem. I see it as compromising myself.
Can I just say, Dr. Golden is absolutely right that the way of receiving government funding is the way of temptation to dilute or change your religious identity and mission. We saw this immediately following the Supreme Court's decision in Carson versus Macon in Maine. When the Supreme Court put its thumb on the scale and sort of opened the faucet to direct funding for religious schools in an unprecedented way, the Attorney General of Maine got before the cameras immediately to say, if this is the way it's going to be, we're going to add strings to that funding. And so the whole drama saga begins. The pressure for religious schools to change their religious identity. This is real. I mean, I think Dr. Golden is raising a vital point. However, these grants are already embedded, in the fabric of our educational landscape. They exist, from vouchers to Pell Grants, they exist. Most of them are backpack style. Kids are taking them with them to their institution. They're not flowing directly to institutions. Somehow we have to come up with a pragmatic way to deal with that while also taking care of that absolutely fundamental concern that religious schools don't get this pressure to change. And the best way is for them to stop putting their hand out for government funding.
No, I just need to weigh in on this. I'm sorry.
Please.
So tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christian students go to Christian colleges and universities with Pell Grants and federal financial aid, without which they would not be able to go.
Sure.
With the students themselves have testified in hearings such as before the California legislature. And these are overwhelmingly students that are middle and lower middle income. And by the way, that disproportionately has met in this testimony that these have been students of color. when the California legislature tried to take away Cal grants from Christian higher ed, it was primarily Black churches and Latino churches in California that opposed those measures, and they did so on the basis of this is our students who use the Cal grant financial aid. They're using it to go to Christian colleges and universities. If they tried to do that to K-12 schools, it would disproportionately affect middle and lower middle income kids in our country. That means it's disproportionately, not exclusively, but it is disproportionately students of color. And so I just disagree. I mean, I think Tim is right. There is a temptation to flatten your mission or to secularize, or there's certainly a temptation from the authorities to put lots of strings on those conditions. But I just think even while it's a temptation, there's lots of temptations. And I think the opposite situation is worse. The situation is worse if you say, we're going to have student aid programs, but student aid programs are not going to be available to Christians. They're not going to be available to Jews when they want to live out their faith in their education. We're going to cut it off for them. That's a secular vision, not a Christian vision. And I couldn't disagree more. I agree with some of the points Tim and I think Bettina are making, but I think that where they land, I just think they're wrong.
Last word for you.
I'll just say this one last thing, and I know this, Todd and Tim Schultz really came at me with both barrels blazing the last time I said this, but there's a fundamental difference in the indoctrination projects of primary and secondary education and the mission of most institutions of higher education.
Yeah, but
right?
the logic of your case, though, doesn't have to do with indoctrination. It has to do with sort of strings and sort of compromise mission.
Tim, it actually does have to do with indoctrination, because the fact of the matter is that if you're a primary or secondary school, you ought to be able to indoctrinate your children with the faith that you're trying to promote, or whatever your faith is.
But I think same with higher ed. If you're a Christian higher ed, you don't indoctrinate at Adventist colleges. You don't teach what Adventists teach about the truth of the human person.
Adventism is the exception in higher education. It is not the rule.
No, it is. No, it isn't.
The people who go to Notre Dame, Tim, who reject Catholicism.
I'd love for us to keep going on with this for quite some time, but the reality is that I think, the only way this is probably ever going to be dealt with is if we start letting people know that, this is no longer the school of the prophets. Either you're going to the school of the prophets or you're not, because religious institutions and education used to fall in that category, but I think it's a lot more complex right now. But this is an argument that we'll have for quite some time. There's a case called United States Conference of Catholic Bishops that's versus the EEOC. And it's interesting because there's an act that's called the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is a federal law that's designed to protect expecting mothers in the workforce so that they can have healthy pregnancies and healthy babies. But recently the law got a little bit tweaked, and now there is an abortion mandate that has been put in as part of the law in workplaces on a nationwide basis. There's a group of Catholic ministers who actually started looking at this particular program and saying that this violates their religious beliefs. Congress kind of passed this back in 2022 and wanted to make sure that they were protecting women and obviously protecting babies, which I would imagine most would think is a great idea. But once you bring in the abortion issue, the Catholic Church and many of their bishops have decided we no longer want to be a part of this program because it has a mandate in there that's contrary to our religious beliefs. Todd, this looked like this was very well thought out act that everyone seemed to be in support of. It was almost like, baseball, apple pie, Chevrolet, it seemed like the American dream. But then this mandate became part of it. And then the Catholic Church and their organizations are like, we're out. What do we look at? We're looking at another situation where obviously we have some federal funds that could sometimes be connected. We have a law that's coming from the federal government. How do we respond to this? How do we manage this?
Well, Orlin, if you ever wonder why nothing gets done in D.C., this is a perfect example, because even when you do pass a bill, even when there is all kinds of assurances this is not going to touch on a hot topic issue, in this case abortion, a federal agency comes in and starts interpreting in the way that it does. And so the Pregnant Women's Fairness Act, PWFA, or Workers, I should say, Workers Fairness Act, passed back in 23, became effective in the middle of 23. And it what the EEOC decided is that abortion is a pregnancy-related condition, right? And part of what this law requires is you have to accommodate pregnancy. So prior to this law, there was no obligation to accommodate a worker who was pregnant. Now, a lot of employers did this just out of a sense of worker relations, common sense, or maybe even, sort of paternalism. But this put in the first sort of requirement. The ADA only covered certain pregnancies. And the Republicans who voted for this and the anti-abortion crowd wanted to make sure this didn't touch abortion. But the EEOC came in and said, oh no, abortion is a pregnancy-related condition, and therefore you have to give time off. And the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops had a problem with that. They brought a lawsuit, they got a preliminary injunction, and then that's now winding its way through the court system.
Well, I'm curious, and I'll defer to my administrative law experts on this panel here. I'm curious as to what impact the court's recent decision in Loper Bright would have on situations like this, because, of course, that's the case that overruled the Chevron doctrine and sent the Chevron doctrine to its grave. And the idea now is that rather than have administrative bureaucratic experts sort of deal with these kinds of issues, they would be put in the hands of federal judges. So I think it's Todd's point is well taken. If you want to know why you can't get things done and why public policy is such a problem, this seems to be the poster child for that situation. So I'm eager to see what the implications are of the Loper Bright case on situations like this, and to what extent the death of Chevron will sort of impede or eliminate any sort of agency intervention like this going forward. Those are the thoughts that I have.
As the only person on this panel, I'm guessing, who has experienced pregnancy,
Yes.
this is good to know. This is an absolutely vital piece of legislation that the Biden administration, the EEOC under the Biden administration, has chosen to play politics with, and it really is, a symptom of our zero-sum political culture. That from administration to administration, we get this sort of regulatory whiplash, because each administration brings its own interpretation to the underlying statutes. And exactly, Dr. Golden, this is why the post-Chevron world is going to be so interesting and, honestly, I think so vital. Because why should courts just be told to shrug whenever a fundamental right or freedom is threatened by an agency's interpretation of a statute, and defer to that agency? I think we are now going to see a more robust engagement with this idea of federal agency power, and I think we're hopefully going to see a little bit more restraint on this sort of back and forth between different partisan administrations on the regulatory framework.
I think this is what Todd said earlier, an example of one of those things that's in DC in American law that few people that aren't specialists appreciate, and that is how much law is made by administrative agency interpretations. All the overturning of Chevron means is that the courts will no longer defer to the statutory interpretations of agencies. It doesn't mean that agencies won't still have lots and lots of power. And I think that's actually bad. I mean, think about it. Would this law have passed if this were explicitly in the text of the law? Absolutely not. Not even the pro-choice Republicans in Congress would have voted for this, and there have been a lot of Democrats who would have had heartburn. So I just think that agencies doing stuff like this is as President Biden would say, malarkey. And I think that, we need way less of this. And it's not even when we talk about abortion. I mean, abortion obviously, brings this, into the stratosphere in terms of intensity. But there's just lots of things like this where agencies do stuff that Congress would have never been able to pass. And I think that's just a good rule of thumb. When an agency does something that would it have been in the statute, would have made it absolutely impossible to pass the Congress, then we all need to call malarkey on that, because whether that's a Republican administration or Democratic administration, it's rule without the consent of the governed. right? It's rule outside of the democratic process. And I don't like it. I don't think anybody should like it. And I actually think that one really important issue for voters is which party, which candidate do you trust more in the administrative agencies? I mean, Donald Trump as a candidate right now is taking a lot of heat because of this Project 2025. And Project 2025, which he's trying to walk away from, but he's got a lot of ties to, is really just this idea of, hey, we're just going to run roughshod in the administrative agencies. And look, there's a parallel on the left. Both sides are doing this right now. I declare a pox and a woe unto both of their houses. But I just think this is a thing about DC that more people ought to be mad at. And I'm mad as heck, Orland, and I'm not going to take it anymore.
You know, Todd, the interesting thing about the Chevron, concept of deference going back to administrative agencies, it almost makes it seem as though these administrative agencies can do things to push certain groups out. But then when I think about President Biden being someone who is Catholic, I can't imagine he would be supporting things of this nature.
Well, President Biden is nominally Catholic. Understand, a lot of bishops have been openly critical of his stance on abortion, believe that's inconsistent. You know, President Biden, I'm not going to second guess his personal faith, but he does not follow his church's teaching when it comes to abortion. He's been very open about that. When you have members of your faith, senior leaders saying you shouldn't be able to participate in mass because of that, I think it really raises the question, are you truly part of a faith if you disagree with such a fundamental part of it? Again, that's a personal decision for him to make. That's between him and the Catholic Church. But you can't put a whole lot into it when it comes to public policy, in my mind.
I'm going to let that be the last word, Todd, but I think what we have here is we're going to see a lot of blending of these type of conversations because the public really doesn't understand what goes on from the administrative agencies to what goes on in the legislature. And when these changes take place, everyone's going to be confused. Hey, Todd, tell me something I don't know.
One of the organizations that publicly supported the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act was the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is now suing over its interpretation.
Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Orland, did you know that every year the federal agencies issue a combined total of around 4,500 final rules? So we are in regulatory hell.
Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
The United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit will come down very strong with a heavy hand, overturning the decision by Judge Cannon in South Florida to dismiss the classified documents case against Donald Trump.
Wow. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
When we shoot the 1,000th episode of this show and you're long in the tooth, they've taken your keys away, Orland. The United States Supreme Court will still have only 9 justices.
Well, thank you so much for that spirited conversation, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more of these topics. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.